So first of all, welcome to all who are participating. We have the advantages here of learning Masachet Psachim for the whole year. It's a really wonderful, rich Masechta, at least I think it is. And, even if we weren't, we would always have a shir before. That's become the tradition in this shir, that before the Chagim, the rabbinic ones, and especially the biblical ones, we try to have a yontif shir in order to set the stage and to prepare, and hopefully to enrich people's yontif. There's no comparison to a yontif where we understand the nuances and the emphases. It changes the whole way that we look at a yontif. So I think it's a very fine minhag that we're establishing, that we always have a shir before the Yom Tovim. But this year, as I say, we have an advantage of being able to accomplish two things at the same time. Tmidim Kesidron, to be true to our weekly shir, and I see a lot of the people here are from the weekly shir. And at the same time, it's a standalone, so that people do not have to have been previously attending. And it's intended to be the pre-Pesach shir, and therefore I'll have a little bit more of hashkafa, I guess, in the end. But I want to do, since we have this opportunity, is I want to pick up kind of the next topic that we were up to, but as a standalone. And that is the topic of Beetle Comets. This year we've been studying the Masechta, as I mentioned, and Masechta begins with Bedikas Comets, the search for Comets, which takes place on the night of the 14th of Nisan. And of course, very dramatically, on the day of the 14th of Nisan, we burn the Comets, we torch the Comets, literally. But there's this fascinating formula, an institution called Beetle Comets. And the question is, what does it mean? How does it work? And what are its implications? That's what I want to discuss in the time that we have this evening. We're not going to be able to discuss all aspects of it. We have only one shir, but to try to get a flavor of it, because in my opinion, understanding Beetle Comets is a window into understanding what is unique about Chag HaMatzos, the holiday itself.
Rabbi, just to be clear, when do you do Beetle Comets?
Well, we're about to
okay, sorry, I interrupted you.
Discuss that.
Sorry.
So let me introduce the 2 points in the first parak, where the Gemara mentions this institution, and then let's talk about the 2 times, that traditionally we involve ourselves in Beetle Comets. Just I'll answer your question first. The tradition is to do Beetle Comets twice. The first time is after Bedikas Comets, as on the night of the 14th, we search for Comets. And when that is all over, when you search for Comets, you begin with a bracha. Asher Kiddishanu b'mitzvos v'tzivanu al biur Comets. It's fascinating that we use that bracha because we're about to do Bedika, not biur. That's something that we've discussed in our shiurim. There are basically 2 understandings of what the word biur means in this context. One is that it means the destruction of the chametz, and from that point of view, bedikas chametz can be perceived as procuring chametz in order to burn it. Right? You search, you find it, and then you burn it. So the bracha is al biur chametz because we're already anticipating stage 2. This is stage 1. Whenever you have a multi-staged mitzvah, you make the bracha in the beginning, because the Gemara says in Psachim, kol hamitzvos mavarchin aleim over lasiyasan. You always make a bracha in advance. Some people think, for example, that marriage, kiddushin and nisuin, are related. I mean, they are related. There are 2 different phases of marriage. Some people think that the bracha that you make, asher kiddushin b'mitzvos v'tzivanu al ha'arayos, it's a very long bracha, and my musical range is limited at the moment. I'm hoping to get it back, but not to become a chazan. But that bracha, according to many, is a bracha that applies. It's said before the Erusin, before the Kiddushin part, but it applies to the Nisuin part as well. Whenever you have a two-staged process, and that two-stage process requires a bracha, you always make a bracha on the first stage. So we make a bracha al bir chametz in the advance of the bedika, because these two are linked institutions, and therefore the bracha that mostly focuses on the climax at stage 2 is already articulated at stage 1. That's one explanation. The other explanation is that the word, this is something we've talked about, that the word biur, although mostly it means destruction, also has another connotation. Biarti hakodesh min habayis. When it comes to vidui maisros, Torah tells us that when you have, evacuated, let's say, all of the maisros from your domain, that's called biarti hakodesh min habayis. You haven't destroyed the maisros. Chalila, actually, some trumos, maisros, some of it is a davar shebikdush. You're not allowed to destroy it. But what you've done is you've extricated it, you've removed it from the home, so that you can do the mitzvah properly. So too, the mitzvah bedikas chametz begins with the bracha al bir chametz, according to some Rishonim, because it doesn't mean burning of the chametz. It means this is when you evacuate, when you eject chametz from the home. Okay, either way, bedikas chametz concludes in the minhag of Klal Yisrael. Bedikas chametz concludes with Beetle Comets. That's when we pronounce the formula of, kol chamira v'chamia so there are different nuschos. Kol chamira v'chamia, any types of chametz, whether it's, the manufacture of chametz, the saor, or whether it's chametz itself. The ika bershusi, right? The chazise, the loy chazise, the biarte, the lo biarte, whether I destroyed it, whether I can see it, right? Libatel v'lahava ka'afra da'ara. Should be batel, and it should be considered as if it's dust of the earth. That's how we conclude the process of bedika. Similarly, on the next day, at the bir chametz, we destroy the chametz. I don't know what they do in Manhattan, in Queens. I used to actually do bir chametz in my backyard. I have a little bit of a controlled fire situation. Many of the shuls, organize, bir chametz. I guess together with the, fire rangers. So we do bir chametz, we burn the chametz, and in the end of the process, again we repeat the bittul, kol chamira v'chamia, deisa b'shusi, etc. So since you asked me the question, and we are pleased with the fact that you organize these shiurim, so we'll start with that. And let's pose the question in the following way: why do we do this? Frankly, why
do we separate it?
Why do we repeat the Beetle twice? I don't have a good answer to that. There are answers that Rishonim and Achronim on that, but what I want to try to basically explain is that Beetle Comets is a central feature in preparing for Pesach, and the fact that we integrate it into both the Bedika and the Biur is not a coincidence. It's a way of accentuating how important it is. But when you take a step back and you think about it, what is it? What does it accomplish? What does it do? So let me explain what I mean. It's very mysterious. Listen to the text. Let's say this text. Kol chamira v'chamia, right? Types of chametz. The ika b'shusei, that are in my possession. The chazite, the lo chazite, the biarte, the lo biarte. Livatel, the keywords. Let it be batel, v'laheva, ka'afradar. Let it be like the dust of the earth.
There's also,
so you pronounce.
The formula also includes the word hefker.
According to the Balei Tosas.
Well,
according to the Gaonim, it did not.
Discussion as to whether it's this hefker or you have to whether you have to regard it as hefker or not.
Right. According to the earliest nuschos, there was no girsa of hefker. The reason that we have hefker in there is we'll discuss in a couple of minutes, that is out of mostly, not completely, but to a large extent out of deference to the position of the Balei Tosas, who think that Beetle is Hefker. So we say Libato v'lehevi Hefker ka'afra da'ara. But if you look, for example, at the Rambam, whose position we'll discuss more fully, in Perek Beis of Hilchos Chametz, second, Halacha Beis, we'll see that the Rambam has no reference to Hefker. Mahi hashbasa zu ha'amura b'Torah, says the Rambam. What is tashbisou? We'll get that in a minute. Sheyivatel hachametz belibo, that you should negate the chametz in your heart. V'yachshav also ka'afar, and you should consider it as if it's dust of the earth. V'yasim belibo, and you should think in your heart she'ein b'rshusah chametz klal, that you don't possess chametz anymore in your possession, in your domain. V'shekol chametz shebershuso, whatever chametz there is, harehu ka'afar ukadavar she'ein bo tzorach klal. It's as dust. It's as if it's something which has no value whatsoever. Completely absent from the Rambam's, description of Beetle is any reference whatsoever to Hefker. And in many of the Nuskos, before the Balei Tosas, you don't have a reference to Hefker. But we do have it according to Rabbeinu Tam, because one of the things that we're going to be examining tonight is the position of the Balei Tosas, who think that Beetle is Hefker. We'll get back to that. Okay. So the question is, what is this? Why do we, keep repeating Beetle? And the bigger mystery is, what is it? And really, how does it work? If I make a speech about something that changes the reality of its physical content? In other words, what are you saying? As far as I'm concerned, chametz is dust of the earth. As far as I'm concerned, there is no chametz. As far as I'm concerned, the chametz is valueless, right, and non-existent. Because you said it, therefore it is so. Let me put it in a framework. The concept of Beetle in the world of halacha is extremely rare. The only time really that we encounter Beetle in another context is a very significant context. And it may be very important for us, but it also, at least superficially, presents an absolute contrast. And that is in the world of Avodah Zarah. There's something called Beetle Avodah Zarah, which means that, like, if you have something that was worshipped as an idol, that of course is reprehensible to us, right? It's prohibited in every way. So people bowed down to a statue or to an animal or to an object. They turned it into idolatry. However, there's a mechanism of neutralizing that. That's called Beetle Avodah Zarah. You can negate the Avodah Zarah. You can renounce that status.
Is it just? There's also an attitude. There's also a physical gesture of breaking the Avodah Zarah.
Okay, but Beetle Avodah Zarah doesn't necessarily require that. Although, and if you do, it's almost as a.
There's a similarity here too. Here, in connection with chametz, you have to burn it, or at least throw it into the sea or whatever.
Well, you don't really have to, from a Beetle point of view, throw it into the sea. That's exactly the point. So let me explain the difference, and then I totally agree. And the reason I'm mentioning it is because I think that there's also a parallel. What is the difference? Very simple. You have a rock, you have a statue, you have an animal, right? So it is what it is in its physical composition. Somebody turned it into a god, right? Or tried to. That's what Avodah Zarah is. You take something that is an object and you turn it into not only a subject, but the subject. That's what Avodah Zarah is. That's why it's so reprehensible, correct? Meaning, artificially, you inflated this physical object into something that it's not. So it's perfectly understandable that part of negating that is through Beetle. You renounce it. You make a speech. But your speech, of course, has to be sincere. But what is your speech? You say, I no longer, or I, disregard the way that people have been relating to this object. As far as I'm concerned, the stone is a stone. As far as I'm concerned, the statue is an image. As far as I'm concerned, this cow or this sheep is a cow and a sheep. That's Beetle Avodah Zarah. That's almost the only other context which we find a parallel to chametz. But the comparison, while telling, and I'm going to get back to it, is flawed, imperfect. Why? Because when I, at least according to the nusach that I read from the Rambam, right, and that's also the view of the Ramban, and it's pretty much the view of Rashi, so on, we'll get to it. If I say about chametz that it's dirt and dust, right, I'm not denying people's, delusions and simply supporting its objective standing and standard. On the contrary, I'm rejecting the physical reality in front of me, and I'm turning it into something, fantastical. Right? I'm saying about leavened bread that it's afar, and I'm saying about, let's say, a particularly nice piece of leavened bread, which is worth its food or it's aesthetically nice. It's worth $100, let's say, or a bunch of them, and I'm saying I renounce it. It's afar, right? And it has no value. And if I have any of this in my possession, anything like this in my possession, I don't have it. So while the bittul of Avodah Zarah negates, right, the delusion, you might say, the bittul of chametz creates a delusion. Not, of course, really. I mean, we're not going to explain in a minute what we mean by it, but I'm just trying to pose the difficulty. Number one, why is bittul so prominent and so ubiquitous? That's the background. B, given what bittul mostly is, according to most Rishonim, why does it work and what does it even mean? How can you decide all of a sudden that, something which has an objective identity, we're renouncing it. We're intellectually and emotionally and spiritually renouncing it. It's a remarkable, it's an astonishing, again, because of the ubiquity of certain institutions, it's good that we're all trained to do them. That's wonderful. Hergel mitzvos. But sometimes because something is commonplace and we're habituated to it, we can lose sight of how innovative and even astonishing it is. And that's the case with bittul. We say it at B'dika. We say it at Biur. How many people really think about what it really is? So we need to know what it is, and especially according to those who see it as a kind of intellectual, spiritual, emotional renunciation, we need to know how that can work. The only analogy is to Avodah Zarah, and it's not a perfect analogy because there, as I say, we're restoring the objective object to its initial real existence. We're taking away the delusion. And here we're denying the physical object, and instead we are replacing it with some fantasy. And obviously we know it isn't really afar. Let me highlight it even further. There is a remarkable view quoted in the Sefer HaMichtam. Sefer HaMichtam was one of the more exotic, let's say, Chachmei Provence, one of the medieval scholars who lived in southern France, in between what Dr. Chaim Soloveitchik would call, the halachic cultures of Ashkenaz and Spain, geographically in between and intellectually and halachically in between. And let me say this, in the world of Provence, the idea that bittul kind of renders chametz the legal equivalent of afar, of dust, is taken very seriously. It isn't just a malitza b'alma. And they struggle to explain it. Ad kedei kach, that the Sefer HaMichtam remarkably quotes a view that states that after you do bittul and you pronounce the chametz in front of you or in your domain to be the equivalent of dust and dirt, if you were to eat it, you would be exempt from the onesh of kares. Now, don't get too excited. I don't want anybody to make a mistake here. We totally do not accept that halacha. You cannot eat chametz just because you did bittul. The Sefer HaMichtam himself rejects this totally. He says it's just totally wrong. But the fact that he quotes it, he doesn't quote, ignorant people. He's quoting a real view, very radical. He's rejecting it. But there's something to that view. It's the most extreme manifestation of, you know what? You're treating it as afar. That is legally significant. It even affects achila. Typically, let me make it clear. Typically, bittul affects bal yirah b'yimatzeh. You're not allowed to have chametz in your domain. There's a double prohibition to that. We'll get back to that. Why a double prohibition? Lo yira'eh v'lo yimatzeh. The Rambam counts it as two independent lavin, two independent prohibitions, infractions. In order to neutralize bal yira'eh, bal yimatzeh, you have to do bittul chametz. You have to negate, nullify, renounce. My best, for these Rishonim anyway, intellectual renunciation, I'm calling it. Okay? The Michtam thinks that this mystical, magical recasting of the identity of the chametz, not the Michtam himself, the Yesh Omrim in the Sefer HaMichtam, you know what? Maybe I'll read it. Just give me 1 second. It's too good not to read, and it's one of those things that if you don't read it, you don't believe it. So, okay. Omar Rava. This is based on the Gemara on Davavim base. So let me introduce 2 more Gemaras before we continue, and then I'll explain what we mean by this. The Gemara says on Dav Daled Amud base, the Gemara that actually we're learning in our regular shir, and which we're going to get back to, that b'dikas chametz, when there is beetle chametz, is a rabbinic obligation alone, right? The Gemara says that if a bystander, even like a child who we normally wouldn't trust, doesn't have credibility, but a child says, you know what I saw, I witnessed, there was b'dikas chametz, it was done, it's proper. You believe him. Hemnu Rabbanan b'drabanan. The Rabbanan, decided that since this is a rabbinic requirement, b'tikas chametz, exploring to make sure there's no chametz. So if somebody, who's normally not trustworthy, attests to the fact that this happened, that's good enough. Hemnu Rabbanan b'drabanan. So the Gemara says, why drabanan? Because as long as there's bittul chametz, this is the line of the Gemara says, Kiven de b'dikas chametz b'drabanan hu, de b'doraisa b'bittul b'alma sagilahu, hemnu rabbanan b'drabanan. Right? As long as you do bittul, then b'dikas chametz is only a rabbinical requirement. It's not a biblical requirement. Later on, those who have a Gemara with you, which is helpful, the Gemara on Dav Vavam base says, Amar Rav Yudha Amar Rav. This is about 3/4 of the line of the way down the daf on Vavam base. Gemara says, Amar Rav Yudha Amar Rav, Habodek Tzarich Sheyivatel. If you do b'dikas chametz, previously the Gemara said, if you do bittul, the b'dika is only drabanan. Bittul's key. Now the Gemara says something further, and that is habodek. Let's say you did b'dika before bittul, which is what we usually do. Still, tzarich sheyivatel. You still have to do bittul. That's the reason, by the way, for our practice of doing bittul after the b'dika. Right? The first time we do bittul, that's this Gemara. Okay? So habodek tzarich sheyivatel. The Gemara says, my time of why? Finally, the Gemara says, Shema yimatzeh gluska yafa, because maybe on Pesach itself, you'll find a juicy, tasty, piece of chametz, nice piece of cake, whatever it is, the daite love, and you won't distance yourself from it so quickly. But if you did bittul, you'll be okay. Okay? Meaning what? Are we afraid you're going to eat the juicy piece, or you're going to keep it? So most of the Rishonim say, we're worried that it's tasty, and you're going to hesitate to get rid of it. And then you'll violate by Rabbi Matzeh, because the effects of the bedika are long gone, because now you know it's there. But if you did bittul, you're okay. The Yesh Omrim in the Sefer Michtam say the following. Listen to this. Pirish, Shemi Matzeh Gluska Yafa V'daite Lave. Maybe you'll find a juicy piece and you'll eat it. Pirish, V'yitem Daito Olav, V'yochlena. We're worried that you're going to eat it. V'yischayiv kares. And you will incur this severe punishment of kares. Listen to this. Achata shebitla, but now that if you do bittul, if a bodek tzarech shivatel, if you do bittul, v'asa ka'afra, and you made it into dust of the earth, afilo achla, have a ka'ochel afaropatur. Even if you eat it, you don't get kares because it's like eating dirt. Let's say we eat dirt on Pesach. Patur. Wow. Talk about halachic reality, right? Now the Sefer Michtam, again, don't do this at home. It's dangerous. This is an interesting, quirky, very outlying position. I'm quoting it because I want to prove two things. And I'm going to get back to explaining it. We don't paskin this way. It's way too extreme. But I'm trying to show how literally some of the Chachmei Provence, practically literally, the Chachmei Provence took the formula, it's like dust of the earth. For them, it wasn't a Melitza B'Alma. It wasn't just an expression. We disregard it. Okay? Now, the Michtam himself says, Hai Perusha Leisa Klal. Says that we don't accept this interpretation. The Vadai Ein Bitol Moil Beino Matzil Michiyav Achila. Because notice, he doesn't say that the perspective that we treat chametz or we look at it, we perceive it as if it is afar. He doesn't say that's wrong. What he says is, it may be correct, but it's not correct vis-a-vis consumption, eating it, achila. This is only with regard to Bayi Rabbi Imate. El hachi kamar, ma'achar de bitla v'yavda ka'afra, if he did bitol, right? Which means he looks at it repugnantly, as finding, I found, this toxic substance or this, unattractive substance. Mi'isale, v'lo osi lemichle. He's not likely to eat it. If he eats it, he gets kares. But his attitude spills over and precludes his making a mistake in eating it. Most of Rishonim say, no, it's about Bayi Rabbi Matzeh.
Question is
okay.
A question is this act of bittul, does this imply or cause a change in the object or a change in the mental attitude?
Exactly. So obviously, in the end of the day, the object is the object, right? So
Exactly.
what I'm trying to demonstrate here is that, like Avodah Zarah, notwithstanding the huge difference that makes it even, in a way, even more impressive here, the mental attitude that is signified by bittul is given enormous weight in the halacha. And that's the main point that I want to bring out this whole evening, but I just want to bring it out in different ways according to different Rishonim. And I wanted to see why that is true. Why, when it comes to, this very significant prohibition, infraction, eating chametz, why is so much of it attitudinal and not objective? That's exactly what we're seeing. By the way, you have this Yesh Omer in the Michtam, and the Michtam doesn't say it's totally wrong. He says it's just wrong about Achila, right? I'll go further. One of the other Chachmei Provence, the Maram Chalava, in his Perush, also makes allusion, as does the Meiri, all the Chachmei Provence make allusion to this view. I don't know who really said it, but obviously it was somebody, as quirky as it is and as rejected as it is, it evidently was somebody of significant enough prominence that, that it's quotable and that you need to explain why it isn't true. That's also a phenomenon. Okay, so the Maram Chalava makes allusion, we'll call it, to this view, and he says, you know why it's wrong? Like most of us don't need to explain why it's wrong. It's wrong because it's against reality, right? Because what we're dealing with is chametz, not afar. But the Maram Chalava says, you know why it's wrong? Because we have another principle in the halacha, and that's called, he doesn't quote this principle, but he describes it, the principle of what we call Akshave. What is Akshave? Akshave is a concept that says, if something is objectively, right, insignificant, and therefore it's as a threshold, it doesn't, it doesn't achieve the threshold necessary for certain halachic, either infractions or mitzvos. For example, something that is typically eino roy lachilas kelev, like even a dog wouldn't eat it. It's not fit for, canine consumption. Apparently canines, will eat anything, according to the phrase, right? So this is not fit for canine consumption. Typically that doesn't have a shem ochel. It's not considered food. And the dinim of food consumption, l'tova and l'ra'ah, the mitzvos and the surim, it doesn't qualify. However, we find in some context, but let's say you eat it. Let's say you like it. Let's say you, treat it as if it's more prominent. So in certain dinim, that's called akshave. You upgrade it. You give it prominence. You project akshave. The word means literally, you give it chashivos. Okay? There's a concept called akshave. By the way, this is a big issue. Toothpaste. Does toothpaste on Pesach require a hechsher? Or things like that. Normally you say it's ein roy lachilas kelev. A dog, I guess there are different types of toothpaste. So they tell me, I don't know, there's Crest and I don't want to advertise, but let's assume for a moment that typically, toothpaste is ein roy lachilas kelev. However, the whole point is that you brush your teeth with toothpaste, you put it in your mouth. So some poskim say that for that reason, we are concerned about it if it's chametz and it's ein roy lachilas kelev, but it has prominence because you use it, then that's akshave. That's a big debate, a big discussion. The rules of akshave are up for grabs. They're not for now. But the point I'm trying to make is as follows. Maram Chalava makes allusion to this very radical view that says that after bittul, if you eat the chametz, you're not chayv kares. And then he says, you know why it's wrong? He doesn't say the words akshave. He says, because if you eat it, then you're not treating it like afar because you don't eat afar. It gives the lie to the bittul, number one. And number two, even if it is afar, you've made this afar back into chametz by treating it with stature. And then he goes on to say a very remarkable thing. He says, however, you're not allowed to benefit, you're not allowed to derive pleasure from chametz either. You're not allowed to eat it, you're not allowed to derive pleasure from real chametz. So the Maram Chalava says a remarkable thing. He says, I think this radical view is wrong because either it gives the lie to the bittul, you pronounced it, you sang it, but obviously you didn't mean it, or you took afar and you turned it into ochel, and as ochel it's still chametz. He says, but when it comes to hana, there's also chiddush. There's no din of akshave, claims Maram Chalava. So if you want to derive benefit from the chametz after bittul, Maram Chalava thinks that would work. Now let me make it clear again. That too is not a normative view. The normative view in the halacha is that bittul does not change the chametz status regarding achila or hana, only regarding bal yirah matzeh. But what you see in the Michtam, the Yesh Omrim, what you see from the Michtam himself, what you see from the Maram Chalava, is they are struggling to project that bittul really turns chametz into afar in some level, and that bittul has this enormous effect on seemingly going back to Rabbi Roth's question from before, on the objective reality, clearly not, but apparently our subjective disposition regarding chametz is enormously significant. And that Eino Omer Ela Darsheni. It's like Avodah Zarah, but unlike Avodah Zarah, it's far more difficult to understand on the surface. I'll give you another example. The Rabbi Yonasan HaKohen Milonil, also in Chachamei Provence, again, because all of them had this orientation. They were very, very influenced by this Gaonic formulation of Ka'afra Da'ara. It doesn't say it anyway in the Gemara, but it says it already in the Gaonim. So Rabbi Yonasan HaKohen Milonil tried to explain it in a more moderate way. What he said was, matzah is a form of lechem. I'm sorry, chametz is a form of lechem. Lechem implies a certain prominence. That's why, for example, you make hamotzi, right? You don't have to make other brachos, mostly. Hamotzi, I don't want to get into this right now, but hamotzi is a kind of birchas ha'seuda. It's a bracha on the whole seuda. Why? Because lechem, I'm not talking about the dagon, not the grain, the wheat. But when it turned it into lechem, that has a certain prominence. And it embodies the whole seuda. That's why lechem has a din of challah. That's why we make a birchas hamazon when you eat bread. Birchas hamazon, like hamotzi, but even more on a daraisa level, is a birchas haseuda, bracha achrona on the seuda. This is all background. Rabbi Yonasan HaKohen Milonil doesn't quote any of this. But what he says is the following. He says, when you make bittul, when you pronounce bittul, you say, have a ka'afra da'ara. What you're doing is you're attacking the prominence of this chametz in such a way, having made this statement, that you no longer perceive it as lechem. So it's chameshes aminim, it's dagon, but it's not lechem. And if it's not lechem, then it's no longer chametz. You take away the lechem component of chametz, and there's no bayira. He doesn't think you can eat it. He doesn't think you can derive pleasure from it.
But a kelev might be able to eat it when it is after.
Well, this is something we discussed earlier in the year, but the Yerushalmi is of the opinion that you can't even feed an animal, even a kelev, chametz on Pesach, because the Torah says lo yeachel, which means it should not be eaten. It doesn't say lo tochal, right? Which means the gabra, you shouldn't eat it. So Rashi on Hayomid Beis seems to disagree with this, but that's the view of the Yerushalmi, and that's the Pesach in the Shulchan Aruch. You're not allowed to feed even an animal. You're not allowed to go to the zoo, on Chol HaMoed and feed the animals chametz. Because it says lo yeachel. Mm-hmm. Lo yeachel means that you shouldn't be the catalyst. You shouldn't be responsible for chametz being consumed, because that's also hana. Anyways, the point I'm trying to make is, I'll give you one other example. The Ralbag, in his Perush on the Torah, brings another analogy. He says, in the world of tumas ochlim, right? The subjective view is very important. Like if you don't want to acknowledge, something as an ochel, and you behave towards it in a certain way, in a dismissive way, it might not have the ability to attain the status of tuma, ritual impurity, because that depends a lot on its prominence, and that's sometimes in the eye of the owner. So the Ralbag, struggling to explain bittul, says maybe it's something like that. Just like in Tumas Ochlin, there's a very heavy subjective component. So too in Beetle, when it comes to Bayra Matzeh, not Achila, not Hana, etc. So what is this all about? Why does Beetle have this extraordinary ability to neutralize Bayra Matzeh, right? Given, if it's true, that it's mostly an intellectual renunciation. Okay, that's the question. But before we get to that, so let's take a step back and look at 3 or 4 shitas very quickly. What is Beetle? How do we know what Beetle is? So if you look at Rashi, Rashi and Daled Amud Beis, says the word Beetle Bi'alma. This is on Daled Amud Beis. When the Gemara says that if you do Beetle, there's no requirement of Bedika. So the Gemara says because once you do Beetle, that takes care of the problem from a biblical perspective. So Rashi says,
does that mean just the declaration or the action, the act itself of destroying everything?
no. Beetle does not mean destruction. We're talking about only our topic this evening is Beetle, which is believe, which is bepeh, with nothing else.
So it is a declaration.
Yeah, that's why I've talked about Avodah Zarah. I talked about it being mysterious. I talked about the radical view of the Chachmei Provence, which expresses itself in 3 or 4 or 5 different ways, all of which highlight that the subjective posture that you display towards chametz is objectively consequential. Even though the object is the object, it doesn't look different. By the way, to someone else, it's certainly not different, right? So look at Rashi. Rashi says, "Bebitul bi'alma, tichsiv tashbisou." Rashi says, what does bitul accomplish? What is it? Rashi says, it's the mitzvah of tashbisou. Torah says, ach b'yom harishon tashbisou se'or bibatechem. On the first day, you're supposed to tashbisou. That's a very unusual word, right? Tashbisou se'or bibatechem. Says Rashi, dichsiv tashbisou, v'lo ksiv tivaru, v'hashbasa deleiv yashbasa. Rashi says, how come the Torah didn't say ach b'yom harishon tivaru, right? Bibatechem, se'or bibatechem.
Yeah.
Why does it use this unusual word, tashbisou? Tashbisou has a connotation like Shabbos, Shvisa.
Right.
It means you
You
abstain, you
conclude.
refrain.
Yeah.
It doesn't mean to destroy. By the way, what Rashi is saying has its roots in Targum Onkelos. On the pasuk Ach b'yom harishon tashbisou se'or mibatechem, Onkelos says tashbisun means tevatlon, bittul. Rashi here says very clearly that this refers not to beer, but to hashbasa b'leiv. If you look at Rashi earlier, on Daf Daled Amud Aleph, those who have a Gemara in front of them, a topic that we did a few weeks ago in our regular shir, Rashi adds a missing piece. Look at the Rashi on Daled Amud Aleph and go down where the lines are wide, 5 lines into the wide lines. Okay? Rashi says, the imishum bal yirah ubal yimatzeh ha'amar lekaman. The Gemara says on Daled Amud Beis, the Gemara that we're talking about now, the sagele bebitul bi'alma. It would be enough if you do bitul alone. And Rashi adds, im masiach daitamine. What is bitul? It means you ignore it, you disregard it, you consider, you consign it, to your emotional, intellectual oblivion, basically. Mesiach daitimine, you ignore it, chametz. Umashvele ka'afra, and you treat it or turn it into afar, right? The Amar, you say, Kol chamira de bebeisa hadain, all the chametz in this house, right? Livata v'leheve ka'afra.
So we have
Okay.
a kasher from Rashi on Rashi.
No, why?
Because on Daf, where was it? Daf Vav, was it Amud Bet?
No,
He said
Dalit Amud Beis.
at Balev. He
I'm
says
sorry?
there Balev. Here he says that he mamash has to make a declaration, if I understand it correctly.
Oh, you mean this belay? I see. No. I mean, Rashi says, Mesiach daitamine mashvele. He also, I mean, we know that there's a declaration. If you don't do the declaration, according to Rashi, there are one of two. I hear what you're asking. It's a good point. Let me say two things. Either the point is that maybe you need the declaration, but when you declare, it's not the declaration, it's the attitude, right, that it reflects. When you say and you mean what you're saying, then it's what's in your heart that accomplishes the disengagement from the chametz. So it's a good point, actually. I hadn't thought of it. I mean, Rashi says hashbasa b'leiv, and here he also says mesiach daitimine, right? That's all without any verb. The verbal may be necessary to express, and to measure, right, the extent to which this is true. Or what Rashi means is, in your heart is enough. And if you want to declare it, this is the phrase that, that embodies, and it captures this theme. Either way. But either way, Rashi is totally consistent that he considers to be intellectual, right, and emotional renunciation. Tosas disagrees. And here's where Rabbi Roth's comment before about the nusach containing have a hefker, right, comes into play. It's a nod to the Balei Tosas. Look at Tosas. Midoraisa v'bitul b'almasagi on Dalit Amud Beis. Tosas quotes Rashi. Pirush b'kuntris midichsiv tashbisou v'loksiv tivaru. Almash basa b'levi. That's Rashi. Tosas says v'kashalari. The hayash basa havarahi. Below bitul. The word tashbisou must mean be your chametz, destroying the chametz. Can't mean bitul. Why? Because the Gemara itself says on Daf Hey Amud Aleph, the Tanya b'shmaitin, Rabbi Kiva Omer, ein tzarech, harei Omer tashbisou, matzina la'avara shi'av malacha. What is that? So let's look for a moment at the Gemara in Daf Hey Amud Aleph. The Gemara in Daf Hey Amud Aleph was concerned with the following. The Torah says, Ach b'yom harishon tashbisou se'or mibatecha. Right? Now this word b'yom harishon, the Gemara debates whether or not it refers to Erev Yom Tov, Yom Yadalid, or it refers to the first day of Yom Tov, Yom Tesvav. In Pshat, we'd say, typically, there would be no question how you would read the pasuk. If you were a Tzeduki, or a Karoi, you would say, of course, B'yom HaRishon refers to the first day of the holiday, refers to Yom Tov. But the Masorah, the Halacha, Torah Shebal Peh, tells us that the reference is to Yom Yadalid.
Yeah.
It's the day before. This Gemara is trying to explain where we get that from. What are the hints in Torah Shebechsav that lead us to the conclusion that we're dealing with Yom Yadalid? By the way, I'll just add, in light of, again, I see many of the people here take part in our regular shir, and even those who don't will understand what I'm talking about. How could it be, let's say the Masorah of the Chachamim is that in the end of the day, the word Yom Rishon means Erev Chag HaMatzos. It means Yom Yadalid. So why did the Torah intentionally mislead us.
Yudalid, yeah.
Well, why not just say Erev Yom Tov? Why say B'Yom Rishon? But the answer is connected to something which we've talked about all year. And in other years, in the pre-Pesach Shiurim, we've discussed it as well. And that is that there's a very special and intimate connection between the status of the Yom Yudalid, the 14th of Nisan, when the Korban Pesach is brought, and Chag HaMatzos.
Mm.
In the Torah itself, in the beginning of the Parshas HaMoadim, in Parshas Emor, the first thing that the Torah speaks about is Yom Yudalid, the 14th of Nisan. It calls it Pesach Hu L'Hashem, the bringing of the Korban Pesach.
Yeah.
So in a way, what the Torah, and this is certainly true for the Rambam, even more than others, Rambam thinks that the bringing of the Korban Pesach on Yudalid is a holiday in its own right, and also the reason, or also the perfect way to kick off or to introduce Chag HaMatzos. I like to say, in a kind of semi-pithy way, I guess, that Chag HaPesach is the perfect introduction to be Erev Chag HaMatzos. Okay, so when the Torah uses the expression Ach b'yom harishon tashbisou armi batechem, implying that it's the first day of Yontif, but really it's Yom Yudalid, in another deeper level, it's true. The first day of Yontif is the day, right, of Tashbisou, in the sense that Yom Yudalid is also the first day of Yom Tov. There are two first days of the Yontif. There's the first day of the entire Yontif. It's almost like Yom Yudalid, the day of bringing of Chag HaPesach, is like Shmini Atzeres in reverse. Right? On Sukkot, which is the parallel Chag to Pesach, we have a 7-day holiday called Chag HaSukkos, and then we have an 8th day, right, which is in some respects an 8th day, and in other respects a Chag B'fnei Atzmo. Correct?
Sure.
On Chag HaMatzos, you have the parallel opposite of that. You have a first day.
We can even go to Brias HaOlam. We can go to Brias HaOlam Yom HaShabbos.
Yes.
So he may have worked, I don't know, Friday night, Ribbon Shel Olam, to conclude Brias HaOlam. I mean, he may. I mean, this is.
Oh, well, we think not, but Kechut Asara,
yeah.
We can't do that, but he could. That's
No,
why we have Tosaf. But my point is that in Chag HaMatzos, the Shmini Atzeres is on Yom Yudalid. It's an independent, and it's an Erev, and it's also a mixas Yom Tov.
Yeah.
So it's B'Yom HaRishon. Anyways, the Gemara says a remarkable thing on Daf Hey Amud Aleph. Look at the bottom of the Gemara. The Gemara says, Rabbi Akiva, how do we know that Ach b'Yom HaRishon Tashbisou armi batechem? How do we know that it refers to Yom Yudalid and not the first day of Yontif? So everybody gives an explanation. Rabbi Akiva, this is the first of the wide lines. Rabbi Akiva Omer Tzarech. Harei Omer Ach b'Yom HaRishon Tashbisou armi batechem. Yuksiv kol malacha lo sa'asu. Matzinu lahavara she'av malacha.
Mm-hmm.
Rabbi Akiva has a terrific proof. He says, it can't be Yom Tezvav, the first day of Yontif, because Tashbisou is Biur. Biur, according to Rabbi Yehuda, is Sreifa, it's burning, and you can't do a gratuitous burning on Yontif. That's Chil Yom Tov. Right? So the Torah said to be Mechal Yom Tov on Yontif, to get rid of the Comets. Chas v'shalom. So it must be that it must be that by Yom HaRishon refers to Erev Yom Tov. So Tosas quotes that. Tosas says, what do we see from this Gemara? Two things. Number one, that Tashbisou means Tivaru. Because if it didn't mean Tivaru, what does it have to do with Rabbi Yehuda and Sreifa? Well, there's no proof. The Gemara here on Hey Amud Aleph is saying that the word Tashbisou means Beetle Comets. And according to Rabbi Yehuda, it means sreifas chametz. Otherwise, the Gemara makes no sense. That's against Rashi. Number two, the next point in Tosas, when do you do tashbisou? Let me explain. Everything changes at chatzos, what we call achilek. In midday, on the 14th day, Minatorah, once the clock strikes midday, chatzos, you're no longer biblically allowed to eat chametz. And you're no longer really allowed to have chametz in your possession. When are you supposed to do tashbisou? It says, ach biyom harishon tashbisou. You're supposed to do it at that time, but there's a catch-22. If you do it too early, we midrabanan, rabbinically, we wanted to be very careful. So we stop eating chametz 2 hours before. We stop getting benefit from chametz an hour before, and we do everything before. But there's a catch-22, right? If you do it too early, you jump the gun. Maybe that's not the right time for the mitzvah. Maybe it's like doing it yesterday. If you do it too late, then aren't you playing with fire in the sense that you are courting, violating by Rabbi Matzeh? Right? If whoever it is could just, if somebody could mute, that would be good. Okay. Again, we need a host that can identify. And,
Sheila, I'll text her.
And again, because I'm having speaking problems, it's particularly hard to scream over it. Okay. So what does Tosa say? Tosa says, from the Gemara in Daf Hey Amud Aleph, we see very clearly two things. Tashbisou means biur, not beetle. And secondly, you're supposed to do biur la'achar zman isuro. After it's already prohibited, meaning after 12 o'clock. That's what Tosa says. Go back to Tosas, you'll see. Tosa says in the name of the Ri, Koshel Ri, the Hayash Bas Avarahi, Velo Bitol, Tani B'Shmaiter, Rabbi Kiva Omer, Eno Tzarech, Hari Omer Tashbisou, Umatzino Lavar Shiav Malacha. So obviously the word Tashbisou means beer. Ba'od, Tashbisou Amrina L'Kamon Me'achilek. Tashbisou comes from the split in the day. Shehu Mishay Shos L'Mala. Va'achar Isura L'Mahani Bitol. Since the Gemara also seems to make clear that you're supposed to do beer after the Zmana Isur. For example, if you think that Tashbisou means Yom Tov, you're supposed to do it on Yom Tov, not prior to Yom Tov. So then it can't be bittul, because the Gemara says later on that once there's a prohibition to derive benefit from the chametz, you can't do bittul anymore. You're not the real owner. The Tosa says, I can prove A, Tashbisou means beer. B, it has to take place la'achar zman isuro. C, for both of those reasons, it can't be bittul, because bittul can't be la'achar zman isuro. So what is bittul? B'omari, midoraisa bittul bi'alma sogi mitam, de ma'achar shebitlo have a hefker. Tosa says that bittul is financial renunciation. It's not my property. You give up on it. That's a legal category in civil law, in the world of Choshen Mishpat. It leaves, legally leaves its possession, etc. So the Tosas view of bittul is that bittul is not tashbisou. It's not a mitzvah dora. It's not a mitzvah. Bittul is not tashbisou. He disagrees with Rashi and Unklas. Bittul has nothing to do with afar. Bittul is not a mitzvah. Bittul is hefker. It's a financial transaction. In order to violate Bal Rabbi Matzeh, you have to be the owner. If the chametz belongs to a non-Jew, or belongs to Hekdesh, or if it doesn't belong to anyone, it can sit in your house. Not very nice frankly. It's not, keeping with the spirit of the day so much. But if you have, after Bittul, you leave the chametz in your home, according to Tosas, not your chametz, not your bal yorah b'yotzei. The girsa, v'lehevi hefker, ka'afra, the alma, is very consistent with Tosas's view. However, Tosas's view is not so simple. And it's rejected by the Ramban, by the Rambam, and by many others. And it certainly was rejected by Rashi and by all of the Chachmei Provence. Indeed, what do you do with some of the points that Tosas raised? Tosas asked from the Gemara in Daf Hey Amud Aleph. You see from the Gemara in Hey Amud Aleph that Tashbisou refers to Sreifas Chametz, Biur Chametz.
Mm-hmm.
Right? Because Rabbi Akiva proved that it has to be Erev Yom Tov. Otherwise, you'd be in B'chal Yom Tov when you burn the chametz on Pesach. So obviously, Biur and Tashbisou are the same. Says the Ramban, not necessarily. Maybe there are two dinim of Tashbisou. When Rashi said, this is an interesting Parshanut point. Rashi never said Tashbisou doesn't mean Biur. Let's look at Rashi again. On Daled Amud Beis. What did Rashi say? B'bittul bi'alma, dichsiv tashbisou, v'lo ksiv tivaru. V'hashbasa, deleiv, hi hashbasa. Rashi says, the Torah, if it meant to say tivaru exclusively, would have said tivaru. Because the verb for destroying chametz, for destroying something, is much more likely to be biur than tashbisou. What does tashbisou mean? It's a strange usage. Tashbisou can mean renounce. It can mean refrain from something. It can mean, exclude. Right? But typically it doesn't mean destroy. So what Rashi was trying to say was, not that Tashbisou exclusively means bittul, but that the Torah was trying to say something very remarkable. By using a verb that is atypical, the Torah meant to tell us this is more complicated than you think. This verb carries two applications. One is biur chametz, but if it had only been biur chametz, then we would have said tavaru. We say tashbisou in order to convey two different processes. One is physical destruction of the chametz, and the other is the intellectual renunciation of the chametz. Both of them are included in the word tashbisou. If that's the case, that part of Daf Hey Amud Aleph is not a problem, because tashbisou means biur and bittul. But on the biur side of it, how could you allow the burning of chametz on Yontif? In other words, Tosas assumed that what Rashi meant was that tashbisou, rather than tavaru, excludes biur. But Rashi really meant that tashbisou includes, alongside biur, bittul. And that's the view of the Ramban, and that's the view of many of the Rishonim. However, then it becomes particularly intellectually challenging. Meaning, we all understand what biur chametz is, right? Especially sreifa. You take this chametz, normally it's the centerpiece of your su'uda, and all of a sudden you're burning it to a crisp as if it's, some toxic, waste. Some despicable, repugnant substance, right? Alongside of that is this intellectual renunciation where it's all about your subjective rather than any kind of objective change or act on the chametz. I'm going to destroy the chametz. You could choose how you want to destroy the chametz. Or there are two methods. One is burn it to a crisp, The other is to make a speech at it.
Yeah.
It's not so terrible, but we'll get to it. Let me say that. That's number one. Number two. I'm going to have to skip anything, so let me go a little more quickly. Number two. According to Rashi, right, this word tashbisou carries two different processes, beer and bittul. Is there any preference? So the interesting thing is that, one second, can everybody hear, by the way? Yeah.
I can hear you.
Okay. I don't know why my computer is telling me that the default microphone is changing. I don't know what that is, but okay, as long as you can all hear me. Which of these two are they equal? Is there some sort of order? In Rashi, there's no way of knowing. But the Ramban, in a very, very, very lengthy essay, magnificent lengthy essay, where he analyzes, the Ramban is the critic of Rabbeinu Tam and the Riz of the Balitosis view of Bittul as Hefker. Okay?
Mm-hmm.
The Ramban says, Bittul is Hefker, so why do you use the phrase Bittul? In Kol Torah Kula, we know how to say Hefker. Even in the Gemara in Davavam Beis, which speaks about Bittul, the Gemara speaks about an example of, Gemara says if they're little perurim, little crumbs, maybe they're Batal because they're like Hefker, maybe they don't need Bittul because they're Hefker. All of a sudden, the Talmud, lost its power of articulation, doesn't know how to say the word Hefker, it only can say Bittul, says the Ramban. Moreover, he says Bittul sounds like Avodah Zarah, like we said before. Moreover, he says, if you look at the rules of Hefker and the rules of Bittul, they're not the same. They don't conform. They don't cohere. For Hefker, you need very possibly Bifnei Shlosha. You need a witnessing audience of 3. You certainly need to articulate it. It's not believe. But Bittul, the Gemara says at one point, right? Mevatel belibo, medayo. Right? And you don't need 3 people. Rabbi Yossi Aglili is of the opinion.
According to Tosfos mentions this also, and 3 people means that you're performing an act of hefker, and not and that's not bittul.
Yeah. Well, Tosfos dismisses it because they say, it's only a requirement midrabanan. That's how Tosfos deals with that. But the Ramban doesn't like that solution. And he says, this is just the tip of the iceberg. There are so many discrepancies. And the biggest one is the intellect, meaning why all of a sudden are we using different terminology if we mean something very commonplace? I'll give you another example. Rabbi Yossi, there's a famous view of Rabbi Yossi Aglili. Rabbi Yossi Aglili is of the opinion, if you want to renounce property that you own and you want to just, let it go, relinquish your rights, and anybody can take it, hefker. So Rabbi Yossi Aglili was of the opinion that the property does not become hefker, doesn't become free for all until someone else picks it up. We don't pass it this way, but that's a very prominent view of Rabbi Yossi Aglili. According to Rabbi Yossi Aglili, if you, suspend your ownership, you don't lose your title until someone else capitalizes on the opportunity and picks it up, right? Ad she acher zochabo.
It's a reminder of Pesach Shabbatin.
Say again. Yeah, we have it. It's a bunch of
Yeah.
So the Ramban says, and according to Rabbi Yossi Aglili, there's no institution of Beetle Comets, because Beetle means hefker, and that hefker doesn't work according to Rabbi Yossi Aglili. And then the Ramban says even further. It's like a magnificent Ramban. The whole essay is just incredible. What he suggests in its place is equally remarkable. I'll get that in a minute. He says, I don't buy the whole thing. He said, how are you even so sure that hefker doesn't violate by Rabbi Matzeh? Tosa says, Hefker doesn't violate by Yerah Ba'imatzeh. Why? Because non-Jewish ownership doesn't violate it, and the ownership of Hekdesh doesn't violate it. Says Tosas, what does that prove? That in order to violate by Yerah Ba'imatzeh, you need to be an owner. Says the Ramban, not necessarily. Maybe the ownership of Hekdesh and the ownership of a non-Jew is negative ownership. Ownership of entities that have nothing to do with Bal Yirah. But just walking away from ownership, maybe that's not, maybe you're actually violent. So the Ramban has a host of questions against the Ramban. Then the Ramban says about Tosa, but Tosa seemed to have proved that it can't be Bittul because Bittul can't be La'achar Zman Isuro, and it sounds like Tashbisou is La'achar Zman Isuro. It's only after it's Aser. Says the Ramban, who said that? That isn't true. Maybe the idea Bittul is that you take steps in advance of the Zman Iser to make sure that when the clock strikes Chatzos, when it rings in your home, Achilek, that at that moment, by that moment, the Comets has been destroyed, or the Comets has been renounced. Why does it have to be that it's La'achar Zman Isuro? What he does with Rabbi Akiva and Daf Hamid Aleph, I think, is a fascinating question. Unfortunately, I'm not going to have time for that because we have to wrap up in a few minutes. What's the alternative of the Ramban after having rejected? By the way, it's a fascinating chapter in Halacha because it's a conversation of the generations. Everyone gets involved in what is bittul. It became like a window, into how you understand certain things about Hilchos Chametz. But it also became a fascinating example of the evolution of halachic thought and creativity. Meaning, Rashi said what he said, Tosas responded. The Ramban attacks Tosas and rejects it. There's a long essay by the Meiri. We know the Meiri from his work Beis HaBechira on the Masechta. But Meiri also authored a work called Magei Novos, in which he has about, I don't remember the number, 35 independent essays on topics, mostly where there are debates between the, Chachmei Sfarad and Chachmei Ashkenaz and Chachmei Provence, like very well-known issues in debate. So one of them is, the Meiri writes in defense of the Balitosis of Hefker, against the attacks of the Ramban. Ramban answered every attack of Tosas against Rashi, threw up a barrage against the Balitosis. The Meiri defends every attack of the Ramban against the Balitosis and throws up some questions against the Ramban. Then the Ran kind of merged the Ramban and the Balitosis, and so on. It's a fascinating chapter, just in how the insights of each of these authorities impacted and contributed to a deeper understanding of the topic.
Recollection may be fallacious. Doesn't Meiri say that the best way to fulfill the mitzvah of hashbasa is to eat the chametz in the afternoon, after the zman, which we take as a man isur?
No, he does not say. Yeah, that's the Balamor. Balamor says that.
Oh, I'm sorry. I meant about, yes, you're quite right.
The Balamor says that famously that achilaso zuhi hashbasaso, but not the Meiri. Meiri doesn't hold that way. But anyways, the point is, so what is Ramban's alternative? So Ramban says the following fascinating idea, and I think this is the key to understanding everything we've struggled with. The Ramban says the whole Bayirah Ba'imatzeh, to begin with, you need to take a step back and look at the whole Bayirah Ba'imatzeh. The whole idea that the Torah imposed a prohibition to own or to maintain chametz in your possession is hugely problematic. Why? Because Rabbi Eliezer, Rabbi Shmuel, whoever it is, on Daf Zayin Amud Aleph, famously says, Shnei Dvarim Einam b'rishusa shel adam, v'asana kasav kila b'rishusa. Or b'rishus harabim, chametz Pesach, which means you're not allowed to derive benefit from chametz after Zman Isura, right? And it's a complicated topic, but let's assume it for the moment. If you can't get benefit from something, that cuts into your ownership. So you're not a full owner. But if not a full owner, then there should be no Bayirah Bayimatze. In other words, the Torah formulates an Isur. This is a fascinating phenomenon. A double Isur, maybe a trip. The Smak and the Ram count 3 Isurim. The Rambam counts 2. Rambam, the Chinuch, and the Smag, 2. Okay. Lo Yira'eh v'lo Yimatzeh. But according to what the Gemara says, there shouldn't be any Isur. Because you don't own the chametz. Says the Gemara, this is an exception. It's just like if you dig a pit in Rishus Harabim, in a public domain, you take your shovel, what are you going to say? And then somebody falls in it, or somebody's animal falls in. Say, not my problem. I don't own the property. New York City owns the property. Let them pay. But you dug the pit. Right? Okay. That's one of the examples of you don't own it, but the Torah treats you treats you as the owner. I mean, that's understandable. You caused it. The other one is chametz Pesach, meaning objectively you don't own it. The Torah said, you know what? Legally you don't own it, but we treat you like you own it. Why? Says the Ramban. This is a tremendous chumrah, but it also, and it reflects the Torah's attitude towards chametz. Meaning, even though legally you're not responsible, since you're the previous owner and you didn't get rid of it, you didn't declare emphatically your repugnance, you didn't recoil from any kind of connection with the chametz, you violated double Isur. Right? Wow.
So this takes us all the way to the original problem that we've been wrestling for quite a few weeks.
Correct.
About socher or maskir of the house, and who is chayav with b'dikas.
That too, right? But even a bigger problem, that is, what's so terrible about chametz?
Yes, right.
Right? Well, let's go a step further. Then the Ramban says the following. The Ramban says this tremendous chumrah, that we treat you as the owner and don't allow you to retain this chametz in your domain, even though formally, legally, titularly, you are off the hook. It also has a kula, but it's not meant as a kula. And that is, there's a way out. Hiskima daita ladas Torah. If you emphatically, intellectually, and emotionally, and spiritually renounce any connection with the chametz. The Ramban, I think, is the first one to coin this phrase. Maybe not, I could be wrong. Rotza b'kiyumo, or ina rotza b'kiyumo. The Ramban says, what is bittul? Bittul is ina rotza b'kiyumo. Bittul is a way of saying, I know that the Torah wants me to renounce it, and I renounce it. I know that even though it's not legally mine, even any connection or distant association with it is still repugnant. I'll explain why in a minute. And I hereby declare, right, that I too find this connection, right, intolerable. Lahava ka'afra da'ara. Eni rotze b'kiyumo. Harehu ka'afra be'embo Torah. I don't look at it as valuable. I don't look at it as money. I don't look at it as food. I don't look at it as Torah's chametz. When I look at this now, for the same reason that the Torah insisted that we transcend even the laws of Choshen Mishpat, of legal ownership, and I go even further than that to renounce chametz, I hereby renounce it. What do we ask to begin with? This isn't like Avodah Zarah. Would you make a speech? It's mysticism. You call it afar. Says the Ramban. It is like Beetle Comets in a way. because it's an art of the Torah artificially has propped up this Isur. Right? Objectively, you shouldn't be connected to it. And you are being compliant with that posture of rejection by saying these words, by thinking these thoughts, etc. Ramban says it's like Yeush, but not Dinei Mominus.
Doesn't the Ramban also say, I believe, on his commentary on Shas, on Pesachim?
Yeah, this is on Pesachim. Yeah.
What? He has a commentary.
Yeah, this what I'm quoting is from the Chidushim on Pesachim.
And he seems to say that Hashbasa is not Hefker, but it is something unique, almost existing essentially to describe the Isur or the obligation of Pesach.
That's what I'm basically saying. According to the Ramban, Beetle Comets is a emphatic Eni Rotza B'Kiyumo, which, together with the fact that the Chometz isn't really in your possession anyway, and yet the Torah put it there because the Torah wants you to
really corresponding to it elsewhere in the Torah. This is something that is unique.
Right. That's what we're saying. That's the Ramban. But the Rambam, let me say, that's why the Rambam holds this way too. And the Rambam goes even further. And with this I want to conclude, and I want to explain just a little better what we mean. The Rambam thinks that this renunciation has to be prior to Zman HaIsur, like Rashi, like Ramban, against Tosas. Mitzvahs haseh min haTorah lahashbis hachametz kodem Zman HaIsur. Kodem Zman Isur achilasa. But again, let's revisit his triple, almost Provençal-like formulation. Excuse me. Thank you. It's almost triple formulation. Mai hashbasa zu amura b'Torah. What is hashbasa? Sheyivatel hachametz b'libo. That in your heart you turn your back on it. V'yachshavosa ka'afar. You consider it as if it's dust of the earth. V'yasim b'libo. She'ein b'rshus hachametz klal. As far as you're concerned, you're going along with what the Torah, before the Torah imposed it back in your rishus, you want it like it should have been. It's ein b'rshus klal. V'shekol chametz she'b'rshuso hareu ka'afar u'kadavar shem b'tzor klal. In the Rambam, it's even more emphatic for the following reason. I mentioned before that Rashi holds, the Ramban says that Rashi holds, that the word tashbisou means both biur, sreifa, and bittul. And we asked, how could it be? How could you, burning something to a crisp and making a speech about it? Like, the Ramban says, in my opinion, biur is me'ula. That's more. That's more of a rejection. But in the Rambam's even more extreme. The Rambam never speaks about biur. This is not known, I don't think, because the Rambam mentions biur chametz, but he mentions it in the wrong place. The Rambam speaks about tashbisou in the second chapter of Hilchos Chametz. Mitzvahs haseh min haTorah lahashbis hachametz. Then halacha beis, mai hashbasa zu. After that, he speaks about bedikas chametz. It's only in the last halacha of Perek Gimel, halacha Yud Aleph, where the Rambam finally speaks about biur chametz. And that's right before he speaks about Bayiro Bayimatzeh. It's almost like he cast it in Golus, He consigned it practically to oblivion. If you ask me, it's obvious that according to the Rambam, maybe the only, but certainly the ikar definition of tashbisou is intellectual renunciation. Why? Because the Rambam, even more than any other Rishon, including the Ramban, although, I think the Ramban was hugely influenced by the Rambam here, though he doesn't mention it. I think it was a subtle influence. The Rambam believes that the attitude, the subjective posture you have to chametz is critical. Remember all the Rambams that we've discussed already, right? The Rambam believes that Rambam counts Bal Yirah and Bal Yimatzeh. The Rambam says in the 9th rule. The Rambam wrote a commentary on counting the mitzvahs. I'm going to finish in 2 more minutes. And he has rules in the beginning called the Shorashim. In Shorish Test, he says, typically, even if the Torah has more than one formulation of an infraction, you only count one. But when it comes to Bali Rabbi Matzeh, it counts 2. The Gemara says that you don't get Malchus for Bali Rabbi Matzeh. The Rambam says, however, if you buy it or you make it, you'll get Malchus too. Rambam's incredibly machmir about Bali Rabbi. Mostly, it sounds like Bali Rabbi Matzeh begins on Yontif. The prohibition of having chametz in rishus based on those psukim in the Torah appears on Yontif itself. The Rambam in Perek Gimel of Hilchos Chametz makes it seem like it begins at Chatzos, Erev. The Ravid takes him to task. In other words, down the line, the Rambam is more machmir practically than any other. The Rambam thinks you can't eat chametz min Torah and you get malchus eating. Paskins like Rabbi Yehuda at Chatzos of Erev Yontif. The only Rishon to paskin that way, and so on and so forth. The Rambam, more than any Rishon, was sensitive to the intellectual renunciation of chametz. Why? It goes back to what we began the year with and what we've discussed other years. It has to be the same thing if it's true. I can't help it. And that is, chametz all year round is perfectly fine and good. No one says it's better to eat matzah all year round. If you're a big tzaddik, so you only eat matzah all year round?
No.
Of course not. It's ridiculous. Nothing wrong with chametz per se. It's an Isur Zman. That's what the Masechta begins with, Tosas begins with. What's the problem with chametz? The answer is that in the context of physical cherus, in the context of no longer being avdei paro, the greatest danger that Klal Yisrael encountered was symbolically the principle of chametz. Namely, you're no longer oppressed, you're no longer forced into a certain kind of disciplined lifestyle. So, unrestricted growth. Let it all just happen. Let the Sa'or leaven the bread. Our view is, Ein ben chorin el misha osek b'torah b'mitzvos. Halalu avdei Hashem, v'lo avdei paro. The Rambam, Paskin, the Gemara has a whole discussion, Rav and Shmuel, whether the Haggadah begins Avada Mayinu Leparo b'Mitzrayim, accentuating Avdus, we were slaves in Egypt, or whether it really begins with Mitchila Ovdei Avodah Zarah Hayu Avoseinu. It sounds like in the Gemara, in the Mishnah Gemara, that's a mutually exclusive argument, meaning one is right and one is wrong. Interestingly, the Rambam in Perek Zayin Hilchos Chametz Matzah quotes both. And he makes it seem like they're parallel. And even in the order. And that's what we do. Right? We start with Avodah Mayinu, but then we include B'tchila Ovdei Avodah Zarah Hayu Avoseinu, V'chnisanu, so on. Why? Because Halalu Avdei Hashem V'lo Avdei Paro. Because the goal of freedom is Torah mitzvos. Torah mitzvos is a disciplined life. It's a life of purpose. It's a life which requires limits and sacrifices for the sake of greater freedom and greater transcendent opportunity. And therefore, chametz, in the context of cherus, is toxic. It's anathema. And you have to reject it completely. It's intolerable. When is chametz acceptable? Within the framework of Kabbalah Malchus Shemayim. I've said it many times. On the holiday of Shavuos, the korban shtei alechem, dafka made out of chametz.
Yes.
On Pesach, you can't eat chametz even bigvulin outside of the mikdash. All year round, most korbanos have to be matzah, the exception of Korban Toda, a fraction of Korban Toda. In the world of the Mikdash is a world of discipline and matzos. The world of Gvulin, all of a sudden on Pesach, we have the standards of the Beis HaMikdash. And then on Shavuos, the Beis HaMikdash has the standards of all year round on Gvulin. But the answer is, in the context of Nasa and Ishma, in the context of receiving and accepting the Torah as a total package, there's room for chametz. Then the expansion, the growth, the creativity, being a junior partner with their bonus, all that becomes very important. So, what better than not only by Rabbi Matzeh, but the antidote to by Rabbi Matzeh to express that and to represent it. Bittul. Bittul, according to Rashi, according to the Ramban, according to the Rambam, according to the Chachmei Pravot, it is like Bittul Avodah Zarah. It's an intellectual, emotional, spiritual renunciation, which is exactly what you need. You need to reorient yourself on this holiday. You need to understand that the Cherus has a goal. You know, we live in a world where people really understand, and I don't mean it facetiously or derogatorily. You know, there's less tolerance, for discrimination. It's a very good thing. And there's less tolerance. It can also be used cynically. That's not for now. The general principle and trend, very good thing. And there's less tolerance, for other despicable behavior which imposes and forces people into situations that is unacceptable. But it doesn't get channeled into a bigger ethical or spiritual orientation. It lives in its own right. And then unfortunately, often it gets co-opted, into other problematic orientations. The principle of Ein Ben Chorn L'Misha Oseh B'Torah B'Mitzvos, the idea of Yetzias Mitzrayim as Cherus, Dafka as Chagamatzos, Dafka as rejecting Chametz, that is the unique contribution of the Jewish people, right, to the concept of Cherus and to the concept of Ruchnias.
Beautiful.
And therefore, the renunciation of Bittul, to me, this Chametz, all year round, it's fine. Right now, it's offer. The Torah wants me not just not to own it, because I don't own it. It's not objectively ownership is a problem. Association, right, and engagement and identification, that's the problem. What's the solution? Renunciation, rejection. A posture of intolerance towards a philosophy which has some benefits, but squanders the potential and the opportunity to be something that is truly transformative, and truly transcendental. So I want to wish everybody a Chag Kasher V'Sameach.
Kosher v'sameach.
Sorry, went a
Thank
little long.
you so much, Rabbi.